the notion of the traditional SaaS model being replaced.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going anywhere, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I don't think that's necessarily like going away, but it does. There's something like that's maybe a little bit different this time, like with this sort of wave of, with AI and everything, because these SaaS companies, whether it's us, tiny AI native startup, or these larger companies that are sort of becoming more AI driven, their costs are changing. So, like in other words, like their cost of goods sold line and the P&L is changing. So like LLMs, are, you're billed on token usage and all that sort of thing. And so you're introducing a new, and also significant variable cost to your P&L on top of whatever your existing setup is. So costs are less predictable than they were. This is a huge challenge with like startups. You see, a ton of these, AI startups are selling at a negative margin today. And that's because the cost of running these LLMs is super high. And people, the expectation is that the cost of, running these things will come down, and I'm sure they will. But the question is if they're going to come down enough for these companies to be able to maintain the same margin that they had before while selling it on a fixed price to customers. So because the traditional SaaS model is you sell it on a fixed price and you keep your costs predictable, and but I think you could have a situation, and I think it makes sense that you'll probably see more companies that are running like a variable cost model just because of the unit economics. And that's what makes me wonder if you'll see more of this. We still kind of stick with a fixed model today, the more traditional model of standard sort of subscription pricing, but I could see that potentially changing at some point. I could see it changing for other companies too. You look at tools like Replit and that sort of thing where they bill on usage, and I don't know. It's an interesting moment, I would say.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conundrum in the sense that AI as a whole it's still a burgeoning space.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is fundamentally not different, though, is when we look at the notion of how do they build towards sustainability. I think that's probably the same thing as every burgeoning industry. I mean, I think we remember the days when DoorDash and Uber were dirt cheap, and it was offset by investors and VC capital dollars, and they were just trying to acquire customers. Is the same thing going to happen with these AI companies where they reach a point where their goal is now profitability rather than simply building a user base, and as a result pricing actually just goes up? And so maybe that changes from usage credit based to a tier based subscription model. Who knows how it manifests?
I mean, the thing with the
different
Sorry, was the last part?
Fundamentally, is it different than what we've seen in the past?
So, I mean, I think kind of yes. I mean, in some cases, because so you look at like you mentioned like the Uber model and all of that, but they're selling on a variable cost, so they basically, for whatever period of time, they were like, we'll accept these negative margins and, keep running on the VC money and all of that. And then over time they jack up their prices and they get profitable and all. And, that's like the classic Silicon Valley model, I think, of, just grab market share, lose money, and then jack up prices and get profitable. And so I think you're right that I think companies will have to raise their prices because a lot of these, AI native startups are selling at a negative margin today, and they're doing that fight for market share thing. And that includes like the big players, the open AIs and stuff, but also like these, more small niche vertical applications. But none of that, at least as of right now, there's not like a clear solution for that from a customer perspective to turn it into a fixed pricing. If you want to have fixed pricing and unlimited usage of the product, then the company has to take on a lot of risk because they're buying on a variable cost and selling at a fixed price. So that's where I think it's potentially different, unless you get to a point like you have with like with like hosting and cloud storage and stuff, where the cost just gets so low that the companies are willing to take on that variable component, which is, I think, eventually where it will go. Like eventually the cost of running these models and stuff is going to be so cheap that companies will say screw it, and they'll be happy to sell it at a fixed price. But I wonder if there will be an interim period where you'll see more of this kind of usage-based pricing and everything until token costs come down.